Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma here in Norman. I am Dr. Jenny Rongo. I'm the Center Director and also the Director of NCOR, and I'm very delighted to be your host today. I welcome you to use the chat box to tell us where you're joining us from. Also share online using NCOR webinars, hashtag Start the Conversation Online. For the month of April, we have 2 webinars scheduled for you. On April 21st, we are partnering with the Oklahoma Higher Education Network to present a panel discussion on Oklahoma Indigenous Higher Education. We have Indigenous faculty, staff, and students who are going to be discussing the significance of sovereignty of Native nations and what this means for citizens in the higher education system, among other topics on access, retention, and educational attainment. This event is free. On April 28th, we shall present a webinar on diversity, senior leadership roles within higher education. If you're working towards being a CDO or a Chief Diversity Officer, Vice President for Equity Inclusion, you wanna attend this webinar. We encourage you to visit our website, ncor.ou.edu for details on all these webinars and to access other webinars on demand. Lastly, registration is now open for the 33rd Annual NCOR Conference. The conference will be held June 7th to 11th. This will be a virtual conference with June 7th being dedicated to pre-conference institutes. Please visit our website to register. If you have any questions about registration, contact Kathy@ou.edu. Our presenters today are Jenny Park, Dr. Claudia Shields, Dr. Guy Balice, and Lisa Gray. Jenny, Claudia, and Guy are all from the Chicago School, and Lisa Gray is from UMBC, and they are all going to be presenting on Killing Me Softly, Suicide Among African American, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and LGBTQ students. The center is very grateful for their expertise. Please post questions in the Q&A box, and they will address them at the end of the presentation. And just a reminder, the closed captioning is available for this broadcast as well as ASL. Thank you so very much for joining us. And now I want to turn it over to Dr. Guy Balice. Welcome, team.
Welcome, everyone, to the webinar this afternoon. I am Dr. Guy Balice, and I am a core faculty member, professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Los Angeles campus. And my teaching areas of interest are in statistics, psychodynamic theory, psychodynamic supervision, and clinical practicum as well. My research interests include working with persons who have been survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And I'm also interested in looking at stress and anxiety disorders and coping among diverse populations. This afternoon, I have another faculty member from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and that is Dr. Claudia Shields. Dr. Shields is a licensed psychologist who specializes in multicultural community clinical psychology and is also a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Los Angeles campus, my colleague. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Whittier College, where she provided psychological services to students struggling with suicidal behaviors and related issues, was a staff psychologist at Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, California, where she launched a suicide prevention program supported specifically for LGBTQ plus students. She was also appointed to the Azusa City Council to serve on the Human Relations Commission. Dr. Shields has a small private practice where she provides psychological services to individuals, including those of college age who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and substance use. Lisa Gray, our second panelist, is the Associate Director within the Initiatives for Identity, Inclusion, and Belonging Department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Lisa's worked in student affairs focusing on diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice for over 25 years, holding a degree in English literature from the University of Richmond and a master's degree in higher education and student affairs from the Ohio State University. She joined the UMBC, that is the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Office of Student Life, now known as the Campus Life, as the assistant director, and has created and led student-centered events, workshops, staffing, and resources connected to Campus Life's diversity and inclusion areas. She continues to facilitate diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice education initiatives for underrepresented and majority students, student leaders, staff, faculty, and campus community partners. And finally, Jenny Park, who is a second-year doctoral student in the clinical psychology program at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Los Angeles. Born and raised in the state of Hawaii, Jenny was drawn to the field of psychology by a passion of understanding those around her as friends and peers and patients expressed psychological healthcare needs that were not being met. Jenny lost a patient whom she met during a medical session to suicide, and upon graduating from college became an EMT in the state of Hawaii, often working with patients in suicidal crisis. And she credits these patient interactions to inspire her shift into the field of psychology. We welcome the three of them today. And I will now turn this over to Dr. Claudia Shields on a discussion of a statistical overview of suicide.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Balice. Do we have our slides? Okay, so I'm going to start with a statistical overview related to suicide. And before I do that, I do want to call your attention to the photograph on this introductory slide. This picture is of a college student who is looking at a traveling exhibition, which was done by an organization called Active Minds. Active Minds is an advocacy group. And this particular exhibit consists of 1,100 backpacks. And those backpacks represent the approximate number of undergraduate students who commit suicide every year. Next slide, please. This next slide is published by the Centers for Disease Control. And it's a grid that looks at the 10 leading causes of death by age group in the United States. And the most recent data we have are from 2018. And if you look at the very top row, across the top, you'll see some numbers. Those are the ages, right? So less than 1, 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 24, and so forth. We're going to be looking primarily at the 15 to 24 age group and also giving consideration to the 25 to 34 age group. Those are the age groups that tend to be most likely to be represented on college campuses. What you'll notice if you go to the column for age groups 15 to 24, you'll see that the leading cause of death there is unintentional injury. Accidents, car accidents actually tend to be the leading cause of unintentional injury. What I really want to call your attention to is the next box down. That's the green box, suicide. Second leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 24 is suicide. The third leading cause of death is homicide. Most people think the opposite. We hear so much about homicide in the news and so little about suicide. Many people really believe then that homicide is more likely, but in this age group and in the age group just prior and in the age group after. So both in the 10 to 14 age group and the 25 to 34 age group, suicide is more likely than homicide. So I just want to have you let that sink in for a moment to highlight the prevalence of suicide, and that because it's often shrouded in shame, families often don't talk about it, so we may not know that it has actually happened. We might be told that the cause of death is a different reason. Sometimes people make suicidal actions appear to be an accident when in fact they aren't. So some of you might have heard the term, there's also this term suicide by cop. where sometimes people will put themselves in situations where they know that someone might commit homicide against them, but they knew that they were actually committing homicide. Okay, so takeaway is suicide more common than homicide and more common than we think. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the next set of statistics that I'm going to talk about are related to African American and or Black students. And I want to take just a moment to talk about how I'm going to be using these terms. African American is a narrower term. It looks specifically at Black people who have African American ethnicity, whereas Black is a broader racial term and is more global. So for our purposes today, because we know college campuses are profoundly diverse and that not all Black college students may not be African American, the statistics that are being reported are for Black students. Okay, so if you want to have a conversation at some point later about whether or not these terms are interchangeable, we can do that, but that's how we're using the terms today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the next few slides come from a report to Congress that was from the Congressional Black Caucus. And that report was called Ring the Alarm. And it looks at the crisis of Black youth suicide in America. And there was the Congressional Black Caucus had an emergency task force specifically to address Black youth suicide and mental health. And the reason that they entitled this Ring the Alarm is because there's this myth that Black folks don't really commit suicide, but we're actually finding that that is changing significantly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So one of the things that this report found is that the suicide death rate among Black youth has been found to be increasing faster than any other racial group. So while overall the numbers may still be relatively smaller, Black youth are catching up. The numbers are moving exponentially. Next slide, please. What we found is that if we were to look at the past 25 years, suicide attempts have increased 73%, so almost double for Black male and Black female students. Next slide, please. One of the things to consider when we look at these changes is that these problems may be beginning in high school. So you'll remember that very first grid that I showed that had the age group starting at 15 with suicide. So we're seeing suicides happening in high school as well. So when students land on our college campuses, they may be bringing with them a history already of suicidal behavior. And this is supported by a study that was published in a medical journal known as Pediatrics that looked at the youth risk survey, youth risk behavior survey. And this was a nationally representative school-based survey that was administered by the Centers for Disease Control. And they looked at almost 200,000 high school students in grades 9 through 12. So again, that supports what we're seeing in terms of increased risk of suicide among these groups. Okay, next slide, please. All right, next, I'm going to talk about LGBTQ plus students and suicide statistics related there. Next slide, please. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. And based on my knowledge at working at Mount San Antonio College, what I learned was that often this was due to a feeling of not belonging on college campus, feeling isolated, feeling misunderstood, experiencing something maybe as subtle, if you will, as a microaggression, all the way to a hate incident or a hate crime where there was actual criminal attacks. And so there was a way in which the importance of managing campus life so that campuses are affirmative actually can reduce suicide risk. Next slide, please. Additionally, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 5 times more likely to make suicide attempts. and 5 times more likely to require medical attention when they do make attempts. So the attempts tend to be more serious, more lethal, more life-threatening. Next slide. When we look at transgender youth, 40% of them reported making suicide attempts, 40%. And 92% of that 40% did so before the age of 25. So again, putting them right in the middle of college age, right? Okay, next slide, please. According to the Trevor Project, LGBT youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to attempt suicide in the past year. Over 1/4 of LGBTQ youth who did not have at least one accepting adult in their life reported attempting suicide in the past year, compared to 17% of those with at least one accepting adult. So you can imagine what would happen if someone's on a college campus full of not just accepting adults, but affirming adults. The positive impact of acceptance from at least one adult on past year suicide was statistically significant. Importantly, this analysis was also controlled for the effects of race and/or ethnicity, age, and gender identity on suicide attempts in the past year. So again, this makes a really strong case for making sure that our college campuses are LGBTQ plus affirmative. Next slide, please. According to the Trevor Project, they looked at suicide attempt rate among those with accepting adults. And here you see it graphically. So on the left, you see a bar, 27.3% with no accepting adult, 17% at least one accepting adult. So you can literally see visually what happens to suicide rates when you have accepting adults in your life. Next slide, please. Now, the Trevor Project, if you're not familiar with it, is the leading national organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people under 25. And on our slide, there's a link to this. This link is also available in the references that we will provide. So if you're not familiar with the Trevor Project, this can be a really good resource for you. Okay, next slide. Lesbian and gay youth in positive school climates experience 70% lower probability of suicidal ideation. So that means thinking about it. So 70% less likely to even think about it, okay? Compared to those in states or cities with less inclusive school climates, where bisexual youth had an 80% lower probability. Okay, makes sense? All right, next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to now talk about some statistics related to Asian American and Pacific Islander students. Next slide, please. Okay, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, suicide was the leading cause of death for Asian Americans ages 15 to 24 in 2017. Asian American females in grades 9 to 12 were 20% more likely to attempt suicide as compared to non-Hispanic white female students, also in that same time period. The overall suicide rate for Asian Americans is half that of the non-Hispanic white population. And so that can give the myth that Asian students are not committing suicide. But let's go to the next slide. According to an article in the Asian Journal of Psychology, the Asian American Journal of Psychology, in a study of 73 actively suicidal AAPI adults, 60.3% hid their desire to kill themselves from others. And this is known as hidden suicidal ideation. So they're thinking about it. They may be making plans, maybe taking steps and hiding it. They also, those who hid their suicidal thoughts were actually often more severely suicidal than those who did not, right? So just because someone's not saying it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Next slide, please. Asian Americans were considered a high-risk group even before the pandemic, according to mental health experts. A study found that a study by the Asian American Federation found that Asian Americans had some of the highest rates of depression and suicide and were less likely to seek help compared with other racial groups. Next slide, please. When we look at COVID and suicide rate among Japanese youth, the suicide rate among Japanese youth has been on the rise for years, but has increased significantly this year. And by the way, suicide rates have increased across the board due to COVID, due to the isolation and loss. We're seeing this among Japanese youth as well. In August, 59 primary, middle, and high school students killed themselves, more than twice as many as the same period last year. So again, we're seeing an increase. All right, next slide, please. When we look at discrimination and suicide, we find that Asian Americans who encountered COVID-19 related discrimination experienced higher levels of anxiety and depression. And when an individual experiences racial trauma, it can lead to a host of mental health issues, including depression, which is often linked to suicide. And so as we've been paying attention to the news lately, we are seeing more and more racialized hate crimes, specifically targeting our AAPI communities. And so again, this is can contribute to increased suicide risk. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to speak now about a case of an African-American student. And I want to say that the purpose of this case is to highlight what happened on the college campus, not to highlight the person in the case. So what's real are the circumstances around this individual. The individual is actually a made-up person that I have taken bits and pieces of from a variety of different folks that I've known from various walks of life over the course of my life. So if you think you recognize this person, you don't. The person is fictitious, but the circumstances surrounding them are accurate, okay? So I'm going to talk to you about a situation that occurred on a college campus where I worked for 2 years here in California. Now, this person, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So the person that I'm talking about, this made-up person, we're going to call Nedra. And Nedra is a 21-year-old Black lesbian who was on the basketball team. She was very tall, 6'5", and muscular, and often assumed to be male, which caused her to feel misunderstood and isolated because she identified as female. She also found that many on campus did not seem to understand basic differences between things like gender and sexuality or sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So there were all sorts of ways in which she was assumed to be things that she wasn't. Things were ascribed to her or attributed to her that did not map onto who she was and how she identified. And so she would often feel like folks simply did not know her. And this led to two things: feelings of isolation for her, but also there were some structural problems at the institution. So for instance, when she presented to the counseling center for assistance and reported to me that she was suicidal, I immediately recognized that we had a problem. Because one of the issues, part of the protocol was that if a person was suicidal, we would call campus safety. Well, this individual, because of her height and her size, and because she was often seen to be a male, and because of racism, experienced folks calling campus safety just because she was present. And the calls would often be, we have an unfamiliar Black male on campus, and that would be enough just for the police to arrive and to begin to harass her. So when she came and said, I'm feeling suicidal because I don't feel like I belong, I knew that I couldn't say, okay, part of our safety plan will be to have you call campus safety. So I went and spoke to my supervisor, who is a Euro-American female, and I wasn't sure if she was going to understand the nuances of this problem. Fortunately, she did. And we agreed to make a different suicide prevention agreement with Nedra, so that she would not be put in a position, if she were feeling vulnerable, to have to call campus police. So that the point of that was just to point to one of the issues that was structural at this college campus that could have prevented her from reaching out for help because of her identity and because of how she was misunderstood. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this will be my last bit. I want to now talk really briefly about a program that I worked on when I was at Mount San Antonio College, different college than the previous one. At Mount San Antonio College, they developed a program called the AAPI program. Some college campuses have things called safe space programs. This is a similar thing. And this one was actually, the AAPI program was actually funded by the federal government as part of a suicide prevention grant. The rationale for that being that the understanding is that if we had good campus-based interventions related to just having folks become LGBTQ plus affirmative, as I said previously, suicide rate would go down. And so while the AAPI program was not designed specifically to assess for suicide, that was not where folks went if they were feeling suicidal, the AAPI program was designed to change the broader structure of the campus and the campus climate. And so we did training. So for instance, when I was talking about the previous case, when I was talking about Nedra and there not being, understanding about basic things like what's the difference between gender and sex and sexual orientation and sexuality and gender identity and gender expression. So we did trainings for anyone on the campus that wanted to understand, this is what these things are. These are these dynamics of human diversity. We talked about things like sexuality isn't a choice. Most folks wake up and experience their sexuality rather than choosing it, and so forth, right? So having that training, which was about a 4-hour certification workshop that folks went through, and it could be faculty, staff, students, anyone on the college campus that wanted to do that could go through this certification training. And then once they had completed the training successfully, they got several things. They got a placard that they could put on their office. So if they had an office on campus that said ally. So anyone passing their hallway would say, oh, there's an ally here. If I need a place where I can go and talk, here's an ally. Most of the students don't have offices though. So they got buttons, pins, backpacks, t-shirts, anything that would identify them as ally. And so the more these backpacks that said ally on them, or a coffee mug that said ally, were present more and more, that started to send a message that, there are allies here on campus. And the idea was that if we could send a message to students that this campus is taking specific strategic steps to create an environment that is affirmative and that has allies, that we could make the campus safer. So I'm going to stop there and pass it to our next presenter. Thank you for your attention.
And now I'm going to turn this over to Jenny Park, again, second-year doctoral student from Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Los Angeles.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if you can see me just yet. So my name is Jenny Park, and for the next 15 minutes, we're actually going to be speaking today about Asian American Pacific Islander experiences as it relates to suicide. But before we do that, I know it's a bit late for this, but I do want to kind of encourage everyone to seek help if you do need it. There's a lot of content in this presentation where we're discussing suicide and related mental health conditions, that might be triggering for some individuals. So if there is a need for mental health assistance, there's a suicide hotline. That's 1-800-273-8255. Or there's also a crisis call center, and that's 1-800-273-8255, same number, or you can text answer to 839863. So I just wanted to mention that before we get started. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of what Asian American and Pacific Islanders are really experiencing and facing as it is related to suicide, and by extension, a lot of the issues that surround mental illness and mental health concerns, we're going to start with some of the information about who is really included in this very large category of people. And so this group is labeled as Asian American Pacific Islanders, or AAPI, but as we'll see on the next slide, there are more than 23 million Asian American and Pacific Islanders, according to the 2019 United States Census Bureau. And so that's just in the US, obviously, and it's really just so important to recognize that this label of Asian American and Pacific Islanders encompasses such a wide range of individuals coming from different countries, ethnicities, nationalities, and even within themselves as individuals, so many different and various identities that impact this issue of suicide. And so you'll see that while this image has numbers from, I believe it was the 2010 US Census and the 2012 Pew Research report on the rise of Asian Americans, there are just so many different ethnic communities that are included under this label. It's really important to note that even this is not a comprehensive list at all. And so there are a lot of communities that are not being represented in the data. So each community faces its own unique set of challenges. If we can just go back for a second. When it comes to history, traditions, trauma, and specific cultural nuances that have been built within, but even more so outside of US history. And so obviously each of these ethnic communities have had history that came from their ancestors before they even came to the United States, because we are specifically talking about Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the US. But there's just such a diversity in the experiences that each of these communities have faced. For example, the trauma that was experienced by Japanese Americans during the World War II era, where there were internment camps and such a division between America, Japanese Americans, and Japanese nationals. There's a lot to consider in how that has impacted how they are today and how they view certain aspects of mental illness and mental health. So another group that we can talk about just very briefly is the Native Hawaiian population. So Native Hawaiians are a group that are categorized as Asian American and Pacific Islander who continue to experience this pain and historical trauma that really is rooted in the colonization of their islands that we now consider the state of Hawaii. And this is really just a root of a lot of the issues that are coming up, especially socially and politically in the state of Hawaii right now. So there's really such a diversity in the experiences that each of these ethnic groups have, and it's really too much to attribute to this one label of AAPI. However, because a lot of the research is done kind of grouping everyone together, there have been certain aspects of the sort of culture and mindset when it comes to things like mental illness and suicide. And so while acknowledging the beautiful diversity of these communities and the individuals that are making up the collective AAPI community, we now kind of have to look at the research. And the research is really addressing this group as a whole. As we'll see on the next slide, based on the 2019 census population estimates, 6.1% of the US population identifies as Asian American or Pacific Islander. And 15% of that 6.1% of the US population who identifies as Asian American or Pacific Islander have reported having a mental illness in the past year. And that's actually equivalent to approximately 2.9% or 2.9 million people. across the United States who are dealing with mental illness. As we're going to be speaking about later, there are barriers to getting and seeking help. And it's just so important to remember this number. There are 2.9 million people out there, Asian American Pacific Islander individuals out there. And that's more than the number of dentists, post-secondary teachers, and lawyers in the United States combined who need support and help in this area. So we can see how this is an issue, especially in a community where, as Dr. Shields has kind of mentioned earlier, is known to underreport symptoms of mental illness and suffering in general. So the natural question kind of becomes, what are some of the specific barriers that are sitting between the AAPI community and their ability to seek help or obtain help when it comes to the mental illness, when it comes to mental illnesses and suicide? And so generally speaking, as we'll see on the next slide, there are 4 major barriers that the AAPI community faces as a whole. And this includes, of course, this is a generalization. I do want to make that caveat there. This includes cultural beliefs, stigma, awareness, and language barriers. So we're going to start a bit unconventionally. We'll start from the right side of this slide because this is sort of where it begins. If you can't communicate, then how are you going to seek help, right? But first, it's really important, even before that, that we note that AAPI individuals have the lowest help-seeking rate of any racial or ethnic group in the United States. And so in 2019, only 23.3% of AAPI individuals or adults who were suffering from a mental illness reported receiving treatment. So as we look at the slide again, we'll start from the right, and we start with language barriers because connection and self-expression are so important in the realm of mental illness and mental health. And so language barriers pose a huge, barrier in obtaining and seeking out the help that an individual needs. The National Alliance on Mental Illness actually reported that 32.6% of AAPI individuals who identify as American and AAPI were not fluent in English. And overall, the rates of proficiency in English really varied between specific subgroups. So if you look at older adults who are AAPI, identify as AAPI, approximately 60% of those older adult individuals have limited English proficiency. So there's really a high demand for AAPI individuals to obtain these mental health services, and yet there's a lack of the availability of those who are linguistically competent and appropriate for these individuals, which kind of creates that significant gap in access to treatment. So besides the challenges that are posed by language barriers, a lack of awareness regarding the resources and services that are available to the AAPI community becomes a deterrent in seeking professional help, especially in this community where support is really typically sought out in personal networks between friends and family rather than professional connections and relationships. It's really easy to be turned away from this idea of seeking help from, oh, this doctor or this therapist. And so there's a little bit of then the cultural stigma that comes with it. So easy access to and increased awareness of these resources is really just so important and will play a really large role in AAPI individuals seeking the help that they need. So unfortunately, there are issues of stigma that are associated with mental illness and, of course, suicide. And there's an associated shame that comes with that stigma, of course, within the AAPI community. And it brings about a lot of reasons for those individuals not receiving or seeking mental health treatment. A lot of these AAPI individuals within this community may state confidentiality concerns. Who is this professional going to tell? Is this going to get out anywhere else? If I reach out to friends, will they tell other friends or maybe my family? And so there's a lot of fear of the opinion of others because it is a collectivistic, a lot of the cultures in the AAPI community are collectivistic. And so when finding out the truth of their struggles, or the less than perfect lives that they might see themselves as living, it's really difficult for these individuals to reach out for help outside of their network and even within their network, as we're going to see. So a lot of the times there's a view that mental illness is considered to be a sign of weakness or even a sign of poor parenting. So this idea really leads to these individuals who need help, not seeking help, because it then reflects not only on themselves, but on their family members. The stigma is really interwoven with various cultural beliefs that occur within and between identities, and that really depends on the ethnic community that they're a part of, maybe the traditions that are involved within those ethnic communities. And so it's really hard to generalize, but for the most part, when we speak about the AAPI community, a lot of the issues that come up are issues of the model minority myth. And so this myth is really something that a lot of AAPI individuals deal with and struggle with, because there's this perception from the outside, from those within the United States, maybe even elsewhere, but mostly in the United States, where Asian Americans particularly are seen as privileged. And there's this misconception that all of them are very well put together. All of these individuals are very well adjusted, will conform to social norms and be successful relative to other minority groups. But if you actually parse out that data, that's not the case. And there's a lot of diversity and variety in the types of success and privilege that each of these ethnic groups actually have. And it also varies by location. So along with this model minority myth is the stereotype of being a foreigner. If you have characteristics that people attribute to being Asian American or Pacific Islander, a lot of the times you're already kind of seen as this, I guess what it says on the slide is a perpetual foreigner. And so no matter where you go within the United States, it seems as if you are not really accepted as an American. There are always questions of, oh, so where are you really from? Things like that. And so this is something that a lot of AAPI individuals are dealing with, and it doesn't help their struggle, especially when it comes to opening up about their mental health and illnesses and even suicide. And there's this stigma, again, just culturally, of, you have to protect your family and yourself from this kind of losing face type of situation. And you always have to be well, which obviously no human can be well all the time. But there's conflicts between these values of, one, whatever you grow up with in your home, which is most likely and closely related to your ethnic background or ethnic culture and things like that you identify with. And then there's the conflict of then these expectations that Americans tend to have, a more Western view of these issues. And so a lot of AAPI individuals that I have run into are kind of battling this conflict between values. There's a responsibility to others, and yet there's no time to take care of myself. So on the next slide, as we move forward, I just really wanted to mention the statistic again. Dr. Shields had mentioned it before, but 60.3% of individuals who were actively suicidal in a study done on AAPI adults hid their desire to kill themselves. And I've seen this so often in my patients, in close friends, or even the relationships that I have built professionally. There are so many individuals who felt the need to hide these feelings that ultimately led to this idea of wanting to kill themselves and this desire to then put out a plan and maybe even attempt. And so this is really, really important. All of the barriers that I have just mentioned and the beliefs The myths are really important to address in order for individuals within this AAPI community to feel comfortable sharing more about themselves. And so I am going to end with this next slide. This is an amazing resource that I found recently on Instagram, of all places, and the Asian Mental Health Collective put this together. It's actually a directory of Asian, Pacific Islander, and South Asian American therapists. And so if anyone has friends or family, or even for yourself, if you're looking for someone who maybe does have those personal experiences that may or may not align a little bit closer to yours, this is a great resource to kind of reach out and look for therapists that are close to you. So they have a list by state.
Thank you, Jenny. And now we're going to move on to Lisa Gray.
Hello, everyone. Just want to reiterate, my name again is Lisa Gray. Since we planned the presentation that you all are now seeing today, my role has changed slightly. I am now Associate Director at UMBC with Initiatives for Identity, Inclusion, and Belonging, a department within the Division of Student Affairs at UMBC. So before I move forward with my part of the presentation, which is really about student care and support considerations on college campuses, largely from an out-of-classroom standpoint, from a student affairs-based lens, I'd like to take a brief moment to do our land acknowledgement, and to do it with phonetic tribal spellings. I can just wait for a moment for us to go back in the slides. Thank you, Dr. Balice. But I will also put this acknowledgement in the chat for you all after I name it. But please note that we are on this land virtually, and we inhabit it to be physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Chumash, the Tongva, the Kizh, the Susquehannock, the Nintego, the Nanticoke, and the Piscataway peoples. We pay respect to the Chumash, Tongva, Kizh, Susquehannock, Nintego, Nanticoke, and Piscataway peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. It is important for us to note and give honor to these peoples, for without them, we would not be able to be in this virtual space or on the physical lands that we inhabit. We believe, as does NCORE, that this is really important for us to always be acknowledging, given the erasure and invisibility that has existed for our Indigenous Native siblings across North America and other continents in the world. And I think this is also related. Please, Dr. Balice, go to the next slides now for my presentation. Thank you. This is also related to what we're talking about here today. How can we collectively make sure that we center student care and support so that suicidal ideation, suicide can be prevented for Black Africana students, Africana meaning African, African-American, Caribbean, as well as AAPI students and LGBTQ plus related students or connected students from a social identity standpoint. Of course, we understand that there is intersectionality within all of those groups. And to just name and make that plain, what we also know is that part of what leaves people prone and a little bit more suspect to the mental health related issues that can result in suicide being something that folks seriously consider, particularly our students. What we know is that what prevents that is visibility. What prevents that is centering people as people first. And what helps to prevent that, to buffer that, is being cared for. To know that either an individual or a community of people care about you, particularly if you are in one of the vulnerable, marginalized populations that we're naming here today. And we understand that there's great diversity in all of these population groups. So again, let me name that no group is a monolith. None of the groups that we're talking about today should be seen monoculturally. There is power and privilege and positionality that shows up within all of these communities that then impact how prone and susceptible students, in particular in these communities, are to suicidal ideation, particularly when we're talking about what is happening in this present moment with COVID. Really, really important for us to note that. So I just want to let you know that when you think about land acknowledgements, think about the fact that oftentimes what it teaches us, in addition to bringing visibility and honor to our Indigenous, Native siblings across the world, both past and present, because those cultures are alive and still with us, people are still with us. What that does is help to recenter us and help us remember that people need to be seen and heard and to be valued for who they are. And if they are that first, if that is what, in other words, we do with people, first and foremost, what ends up happening invariably is that people end up feeling like they want to be here. Our students feel that they can take up space. Our students, as well as staff and faculty who are connected to all of these communities, feel that they will be if they're not here. And that is huge. That is huge. So I want us to sit with that as we think about what we all could be doing as students, staff, and faculty, as well as perhaps family members and community members that are on this call as it relates to student care and support. So next slide, please. I really want to just make sure that I honor adding at this point to the chat what I promised, and that is the land acknowledgement. So you all will see that in a moment for those of you who would like to see in the chat what I just named. So there you have it. Now on this slide, what you have here, again, we are breaking out our presentation today to center three very specific yet diverse underrepresented populations of students, and all of the research that Dr. Shields, as well as Jenny just shared with you is still relevant here. Again, my purpose in kind of amplifying this part of our presentation is to really talk about what can we all do beyond folks who have, say, named positions in counseling psychology, who are wonderful folks to really help us in the moment to disrupt suicidal ideation for AAPI students, as well as for Black Africana students, as well as LGBTQ plus students. Well, first, we have to know about some resources. We have to know what our resources are on our campuses, as well as what are some community-based resources. And so what I've done in these next few slides is just giving you some examples to look at and to tap into as in-person and online campus-based supports that we feel really exemplify in a better practices way. And I say that intentionally because there is no such thing in my view as a best practice as it relates to suicide prevention. And it won't be until we have ended suicide. So there are better practices. And so these are just some better support-based ways for us to provide suicide prevention on the ground outside of the classroom primarily. So what I want to call your attention to is what you're seeing on the slide here, just a few, like I said, national and campus-based resources. The first is the Asian American Federation's Asian Life Net Hotline. And they offer several languages on this hotline: Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, Fujianese are offered. And so that's important to note. On my next slide, which I'm not going to ask to move to just yet, you will see a screenshot of this particular hotline, so that if you would like to screenshot on your end during this presentation, if you have that capability, you can do so. Next, there's the Asian Mental Health Collective, and then also the Asian American Suicide Prevention and Education Project. Each and every one of these resources are primarily national here, and that is because this is an area where a lot of our campuses aren't doing well. And I say that because of the close work that I have with my colleagues in the Counseling Center at UMBC, who I respect greatly and who keep really many of their fingers on the pulse, if you will, of what is happening for the AAPI population as relates to suicide prevention. And they have assured me that we are not doing well in higher ed on this. We have work to do to really center AAPI students as it relates to suicide prevention and suicide protective factors. So what I am going to do at this point is put these links in the chat for you, or at least the names. I don't know if the links will come through, but these are the names of the groups that you can look up in Google and then hopefully follow along with if you wish. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the screenshot of the first resource that I just referenced. So again, if you wish to screenshot this for your phone or on your computer, I encourage you to do so. I think it is important to note that this hotline is really important to have on the ready. Any hotline, especially when we're talking about multiple ways that people access information right now. We need to be mindful of the fact that folks can call as well as go online or stop in if they're able to do so safely in COVID. So it's important to kind of be mindful of those numerous ways that people are getting information. And especially as we continue in virtual work environments and class environments, it's important to note that. But what I like about this resource is that, again, it's centered in the AAPI cultural experience, and it's also kind of offering a number of different resources that folks can use very immediately in conversations with AAPI folks in their life who they may be concerned about from a mental health perspective. Okay, next slide please. Thank you. Now our Black Africana students, again, just offering a few community-based supports to all of you that I found to be helpful in my search for these for myself and my work at UMBC, as well as my community-based work. So again, we have a series of in-person and online campus and community-based support resources here. The Call Black Line, which there will be a screenshot of this shown to you all in the next slide. The Suicide Prevention and Resource Center for Black Lives Matter in Suicide Prevention. That particular page is very, very helpful. The Suicide Prevention and Resource Center that is dedicating a page, again, to Blacks and African Americans. Keep in mind with all of these resources that the use of terminology to describe the diasporic folks, whether it's in the AAPI communities that I just named in the previous slides, or with the Black Africana communities, folks are using language and terms differently. A lot of times what we know with racial and ethnic terms is that the term Black is sometimes used to talk about folks who may not be Black African American, but may be of various Black Caribbean descent or cultural perspectives and national origins, as well as from African cultural perspectives and national origins. So please keep that in mind as you access these resources. So again, I am going to copy and put all of these in the chat for you all who may want to, as I am talking, go ahead and start to look at these resources on your end. And next slide, please. This is the screenshot of the Call Black line that I referred to. What's wonderful, I think, about this is that, again, culturally responsive and connected resources that are centered in the Black experience is interwoven into this page and this resource. So they've done some deep work intersectionally here on the Call Black line as well. And so that deserves some note. They are very clear about providing a space for peer support, counseling, for, as they say, witnessing and affirming the lived experiences to folks who are most impacted by systemic oppression with an LGBTQ plus Black femme lens. So again, intersectionality is being thought about with the folks who are putting this call line out there. And that is important for us all to be mindful of. Again, no community is a monolith. There are different levels of diversity, different levels of power, privilege, and positionality in all of the communities that we are referencing today. They also are very clear on maintaining that Black line or Call Black line prioritizes BIPOC folk. So even if you're not Black identified, what they are signaling here is that they will still help. So again, sometimes what we find with resources that are or on its face, I should say, kind of targeting a specific population, sometimes we immediately think, well, that's not for me. What they are saying here that I think is wonderful is that they are here for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And that's an important piece to note. Next slide, please. And now I just want to highlight our LGBTQ plus students, some campus and community-based support pieces and resources that I found very helpful. The Baltimore Transgender Alliance, the Pride Center of Maryland, the Queer Exchange or Exchanges, which are Facebook pages actually, with in this case, the Baltimore DC corridor area, the Baltimore and Burbs LGBTQ plus social networking, and the Trevor Project, which Dr. Shields named earlier in our presentation. So I wanna just again highlight these are somewhat regionally based community supports. I realize that we have people on this call from all over the country and maybe even beyond the US. Please don't see these as prescriptive and that you cannot necessarily find these types of resources in your particular areas. I encourage you to actually do some searching because what I found in my connections in reaching out to different resources, both on my campus and off, is that oftentimes multiple cities have some version of all of these supports. It's just a matter of looking for them largely. So again, I will put all of these names in the chat for you so that you have them available to do some searching if you wish to do that now. Okay, so there you go. So I think an important thing for me to kind of also highlight about these resources at this point are that these are folks, community-based organizations, primarily who are doing really grassroots level work and reaching people for whom we may not be able to reach for various reasons on our campuses, physical campuses. What we know is that sometimes it's safer for many of our LGBTQ plus students, given our campus climates and how open and affirming we really are versus what we say we are for them. They may not feel safe accessing mental health related or other resources for support on our particular campuses. Again, what that says is that we just still need to do more work to be who we say we are in terms of our missions, in terms of our institutional ways that we do our work. What I found is that a lot of our college and university students go to these supports off campus, particularly in our LGBTQ plus population, because of that sense of safety, because of that sense of anonymity that some of these resource centers are very familiar and very practiced at providing, whether in person or online or through hotlines in terms of phone supports that they may offer. I think I want to highlight one particular piece or resource group on this slide, and that's the Pride Center of Maryland, because I think they do some amazing work. They offer in-person and online support for queer exchange networks as well. So there's kind of an interesting interplay between their in-person and their online work and outreach work, and their partnership and collaboration is robust. So the Queer Exchange Networks are essentially a series of private Facebook groups, local, national, and international, that function as buy-sell or trade groups. However, these folks actually use them for all different types of reasons. Folks can use them for community-based support, resource friends, as well as other reasons. So those are just a few of the examples of the community organizations that I wanted to highlight in the Baltimore, Washington, DC corridor, as well as nationally. And I put them in the chat for you all to access as well. Thank you, and next slide. So now I'd like to just again show you a screenshot of one of those resources. This is a screenshot of, I believe, the Baltimore Transgender Alliance page, Facebook page. Again, really robust community of folks who show up for a variety of reasons, but what they have been successful in doing is creating the kind of community care that helps to buffer students in particular and youth who are LGBTQ plus from some of the things that make them, say, more susceptible to suicidal ideation, and really help them to find other supports that then dovetail with who they are as students on campus. And they're more than willing to work with colleges and universities on this. And I find in some cases much more willing to work with us than we have managed to figure out how to work with them. And that's something to note that has impressed me. Next slide, please. And now lastly, I just want to highlight some just overall campus and community-based support resources for students of all social identities that I have found are doing some really good work. And shameless plug, there's a lot of UMBC resources on here that I'm highlighting. But that is because I truly believe we are doing this pretty well, comparatively speaking, when I think about the whole national landscape of support that is for vulnerable, marginalized populations, particularly as it relates to diverse racial, ethnic, and also sexual orientation and gender identity-based populations. We're doing some amazing work, if I do say so myself. And yes, again, I did a shameless plug on that. But just the few resources that I wanna, again, speak to here are the UMBC Initiatives for Identity, Inclusion, and Belonging Department. That's my department, but specifically our Mosaic Center, our Interfaith Center, and Pride Centers, all student-focused spaces that provide everything from lounge spaces for students to just hang out and study, to getting free coffee, tea. We have microwaves. We are, providing refrigerators when we can as well. And also, this is a place where students can feel that they will be openly affirmed for who they are in terms of the social identities that they come to us naming from a self-identity standpoint, as well as wanting to experience and kind of be in community with others across their identities. I am just proud of the work that we've been able to build over time, because what we know is that success is never final. If there is such a thing as success in doing diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice work, but particularly as it relates to supporting vulnerable and marginalized populations to help make sure that their mental health needs are properly centered in their full experience with us on campus. We've been paying attention, and we've been really putting a little bit more meat behind what we say, by actually really doing what we say we will do from a vision and mission standpoint, or we're trying to do our best with that. Again, we're not perfect, but we are doing, I think, a pretty good job overall, comparatively speaking. I just put into the chat again the names of all of the resources that are on this slide if you wish to do some Google searching on your own, either now as we start to morph into our Q&A or later. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of our My UMBC group page for our initiatives for Identity, Inclusion, and Belonging Department. I encourage you all, if you wish, to visit and just kind of see the different resources that we offer and the ways that we offer them. We have a number of statements of support for different AAPI communities, different Black Africana communities, and even our LGBTQ plus communities, as we have been moving through COVID and knowing how COVID has laid bare some of the equity gaps, the isms around race and gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnic background, national origin, the xenophobia. What we know is that well-crafted statements that actually mean something are heard by students. Ones that are just done in a way that is meant to be performative do not mean much. And then that can get in the way of us really reaching students who really need us to be the supports to them in their on-campus lives, as well as their off-campus lives. All right, so I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for allowing me to share some of the resources that I think would be important for all of us to be mindful of. And I think now I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Balice, who will move us through the next part of our presentation.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, panel, for the presentation this afternoon. I wanted to make one brief statement to repeat earlier what Jenny said and to refer to some of the comments that Lisa made as well. In circumstances like these, oftentimes, because we have such a large audience and so many participants here today, judging by the looks in the chat, to remind others that who may be experiencing or are concerned about any thoughts that we've been discussing regarding suicide or self-harm. We have these numbers made available to you earlier, National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and the other resources that we have available to repeat that. So from there, I would like to segue into our Q&A, and I was noticing that we have so many questions that I'm not sure I can keep track of all these questions. And I'm going to start with a question regarding intergenerational communication in Asian American families, specifically studies of older generations of Japanese Americans sharing their experiences of internment with younger generations, and whether that helps younger generations cope with current racism and resulting suicidal ideation. So have there been any studies in that area, panel?
Dr. Balice, this is Dr. Shields. I am not aware of a specific study, but I am aware of the work of Dr. Ina. And anyone who's interested, there's a documentary that she did entitled Children of the Camps. And she spends time, I think she probably spends about a week or weekend with individuals who were babies, were very, very young at the time of the Japanese internment. And she talks about, and you get to hear, she talks about it, and you also get to hear from the people in the group that she's facilitating over this weekend about the intergenerational experiences and about how important it is to have the intergenerational communication and understanding for the general mental health and well-being, including things like depression. And specifically, we know that one of the most significant risk factors for suicide is depression. And so when we can reduce depression through interventions like the one that Dr. Ina made, we believe that we also do, in fact, reduce the risk of suicide.
And I think that this is such a great question because while I'm not sure that there are studies so specific to intergenerational communication in Asian American families, specifically the Japanese American families who then speak about these experiences of internment, just based on a quick Google search, there are a lot of articles about intergenerational communication styles, and even more so, it's not just the content of what's being told, it's how it's being told as well. And so this question really highlights a lot of the protective, but also some of the more difficult aspects of living as an individual, especially who may not speak the same primary language as maybe your other family members. And so this is a great question. I'm not sure about the studies, but just like Dr. Shields said, there are so many symptoms that we can look for. And as far as intergenerational communication goes, it really varies culture to culture. We typically see that those who have immigrated here, when they have children, it's really difficult for the children to, one, completely be able to feel comfortable having this line of communication with their parents. Solely, even just thinking about the difference in language, what their parents maybe came with versus what they have to speak in this country. And so this is a great question. I'm sorry that I'm not able to answer about this study specifically, but I hope that's sufficient.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think as the question implied, as a means of the older generation communicating and helping the younger coping, certainly speak to that. I think you have. So thank you. And we have another question related earlier to, and this question is directed to soon to be Dr. Park. It isn't just our students, but us as professionals in these communities who experience higher rates of suicide and suicidal ideation, and care is very limited for those of us in higher education. I thought you might want to speak to that, Jenny.
Yeah, no, I think that's an amazing point. There are, again, just all of these barriers that we're faced with as Asian American Pacific Islanders, and the research is not very clear. There are so many things that we can do better on, in other words, right? There's a lot of research done, but there's just so many nuances to the different cultural backgrounds. And so when we're thinking about professionals, especially in the helping professions, because that is one of the kind of areas that a lot of, especially Asian Americans, tend to go toward. And there's a whole lot of cultural factors that kind of go into that as well. But when we think about those individuals who are constantly helping others, we do have to ask that question of whether or not they are getting help and whether or not help is even offered to those individuals. There is this idea of, again, just Asian Americans being very put together, not having so many issues, right? And that is so false. And there are so many just indications, I think, that this is such an unnecessary pressure, especially on those who are working in these professional capacities. So.
Thank you, Jenny. And I have a related question here to the denial of suicidal ideation or thinking about committing suicide. Is that due, you believe, to culture or because of these persons in these varying ethnic groups, for example, feeling less heard?
I think it's a mix of both. And I think that if you hear the way that individuals who are experiencing suicidal ideation or thoughts speak about their experiences when given the opportunity, it really, really goes to show that one, there are so many cultural burdens or barriers that are in place that are, when done right, meant to protect the unit as a family, right? There are just so many of those barriers that have become more detrimental to these individuals. And because we have certain cultural beliefs about protecting family, protecting our unit, it becomes difficult to break through that wall and reach out to family members or even close friends to let them know that there is something wrong, that you are not feeling well, and that there are things that they are going to have to pick up on when you're not feeling as if you can contribute 100%. So there's this obligation to family or others and trying to help the community. And again, this is, of course, generalizing, but there's this burden of wanting to be that person for those around you, and yet needing someone to be that person for you. And yet there's that, again, wall of just not being able to communicate that due to that pressure, due to just, yeah, I think it's a lot of cultural beliefs, but also just the lack of communication about these things. We don't typically talk about it from a young age. And so we're always taught, you know, at least in my experience, achievements and success, make your way through life and do it so that you are able to bring kind of honor to all of the sacrifices that your family members previously have made. And so that's something that I personally have experienced. And I think that kind of answers this question.
And thank you, Jenny. If I could add to particularly the second half of that question, the part about feeling less heard, I'm going to answer it from the perspective of a person who's not AAPI and how much I have to struggle to hear accurately and appropriately. Because we're coming from such different worlds and worldviews. And so I will just quickly say that I had a student come up to me one day after I did a talk on suicide, and she just stood there. Do you have any questions? No, but she stood there. And finally, over time, as the room emptied and I continued to sort of just orient to her, she finally shared with me that she was actively suicidal. But it would have been very easy for my Western mind to say, okay, you don't have any questions. Okay, bye, have a good day. Right. And so that feeling heard or not feeling heard can literally come from not being heard and making sure that we can get that skill set to be able to hear.
Thank you, Jenny and Dr. Shields. Another question, more general, I think that anybody here on the panel could answer. And it was, thank you for bringing up the potential danger of calling the police as part of a safety plan, specifically for BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus students. Are there any strategies that any of you are doing on your campuses to shift mental health welfare checks away from police departments and other strategies that have less harm or potential harm, given the circumstances that we're facing right now, socially and politically?
Well, on the college campus where this incident occurred, that was, I think, a wake-up call to the entire campus that we needed to look more specifically at allowing direct communication with therapists. And so prior to that time, the issue was more protecting the therapist time. So we weren't giving out cell phone numbers or pager numbers. And we realized that we needed to rethink that this strategy may not actually work. So.
And a related question to this then, and good segue. Can you speak to what safety ought to look like on college campuses and what considerations therapists, counselors need to uphold when working with LGBT or AAPI or BIPOC populations? As a university counselor, I'm saddened by the number of colleagues who don't always feel comfortable speaking about these kinds of issues and focus the conversation more on academics. I'll repeat that again. What should safety look like?
I'd like to answer that, Dr. Balice. I think safety looks like partnership and collaboration with people who actually have those student populations trust and those students themselves, and making sure that in the case of, say, for instance, our counseling center, they routinely partner with those of us in the initiatives for identity, inclusion, and belonging, and other departments that have direct relationships with the student populations that they are trying to reach and to help. They don't make the assumption that those populations are going to just automatically come to them. So I think community-based outreach from a counseling perspective, when done well, results in all groups of students, vulnerable and marginalized, inclusive of LGBTQ+ students, to feel safer, because it's about relationship building, one. Two, I would say making sure that counseling centers actually have folks who they themselves understand where they sit in terms of their own sexual orientation and gender identity, have done some self-work. And I would say the same is true for some of the Black Africana populations as well as AAPI populations. There was a question, I think, in the chat that alluded to how can you be mindful that statements that declare an institution as an ally aren't performative. Well, there's a difference between naming oneself as an ally and being an allyship. If you are naming yourself as an ally, that's the problem. It is not a self-appointed kind of label. We don't self-identify as allies. So there you go. That's how I would answer that. People will respond to safety nets once they feel seen and heard.
You know, I was just typing a response to a question about that in the Q&A as well. And I wanted to mention that with the Ally program at Mount SAC, that program was originally developed by a member of a trans community. And his goal in developing it was so that he himself would certify people as allies. In other words, it was something given to them rather than them sort of saying, this is what I am. And yes, allyship is something that we aspire to, and it is a lifelong journey. I think it's like you said, there's no best practices, right? There's better practices. I think that allyship is something that we're constantly growing in and aspiring to become, right? So good word.
And the critical component of outreach, Lisa, I wanted to say, I'm getting a note here in the chat that we are out of time this afternoon. So I would like to thank everyone on the panel for the questions this afternoon and for the opportunity to be the moderator here.
I want to express our appreciation on behalf of NCOR to Dr. Balice, to Dr. Shields, Jenny Park, and Lisa Gray for such a great conversation. Again, make sure you save your chat so that you can have those resources to check them out, share with your faculty, your students, and others who may need them. I also want to appreciate all of our attendees from across the country. Thank you so very much for joining us. Please drop a thank you note there for our panelists. I want to thank you, my anchor team here at OU, our team at Sorenson, ASL, and closed captioning. Thank you all so very much. Again, I want to remind everybody that Anchor is open for registration. So visit our website, please register. If you have any questions about registration, Kathy at ou.edu or Anchor at ou.edu. And we look forward to joining you in June. But before that, we have 2 other webinars. Check us out and join us. And thank you so much, everybody, for this important conversation. So from the University of Oklahoma here in Norman, thank you very much. our West Coast folks and Maryland. Thank you so much, Lisa, Claudia, Jenny, and Guy. Thank you all so very much, and have a good evening.